young people of color are disproportionately represented at every single decision point in our youth justice system. So if you start at incarceration, which is obviously, the harshest outcome you can have, Black young people in Massachusetts are 7 times as likely to be incarcerated as their white counterparts. That's the 11th worst rate in the nation. In Massachusetts, we often talk about where we're in the top 5 or the top 10. Well, when it comes to rates of incarceration for Black youth, we're very close to the bottom 10 there. And for Hispanic young people, they're 5.7 times as likely to be incarcerated. And that's actually the worst rate of disparity in America.
Wow.
So when you look at incarceration and that outcome, our disparities are really high. But I don't want to present as if incarceration is the only decision point where that exists. If you go to, there's a Juvenile Justice Policy and Data Board in Massachusetts, which was created out of the 2018 Criminal Justice Reform Act. And, they release a report to the legislature annually. And when you look at that report and you look at all of the decision points in the juvenile justice system, from arrest to having cases filed in court, to being sentenced to probation, to be committed to the deep end of the system, our young people of color are disproportionately represented at each of those, between 2 and 4 times for Black youth, and between 1.5 and 2.5 for Hispanic youth, at all those different decision points. So there's a consistency in disparity really peaking at the incarceration point.
Now, is there any evidence that youth of color actually have more infractions or commit more crimes? Because I feel like that is one of the perceptions, that it is probably a percentage of the US voters that probably have that perception that, this system is keeping us safe because there is a disparity in who is committing, crimes or violations. And what's the truth?
That is a long-standing stereotype driven by the media and other sources, but in reality, it's simply not true. So in 2017, there was a detention utilization study that was commissioned here in Massachusetts, which looked at, that detention point that I talk about, who is going into detention and are there disparities? That studied, it controlled for charge type, as well as for age and gender. So it basically says, here are 2 young people, same age, same gender, same charge level, and so that was the lens through which it was done. And that study found that Black youth in Massachusetts are 91% more likely to be detained than white youth, even when you control for charge type. So even when you're looking at a similar type of charge, you see that significantly greater likelihood that Black kids are going to be detained. Outside of that study, you look at national research. There's a book called Reforming Juvenile Justice, and it found that disparities cannot be adequately explained by differential offending, and it points to a few other factors. One being, differential enforcement, how police, enforce our community. So let's take a scenario of a group of young people are sitting on a wall hanging out. Does that officer in the suburbs drive up and just say, move along? Whereas in the city, an officer drives up and those young men are put against the wall and they are patted down or frisked or maybe even arrested for trespassing. That's not the kid's behavior, it's how the adults are interacting. There's also differential processing. Aren't all kids getting equal access to diversion? Are some kids getting a case dismissed with community service and other kids are getting a continuance without a finding, which is supervised by probation? That decision of who gets committed to secure confinement versus who doesn't. That's really what makes up those disparities, not how the kids are acting.
How are kids, coming into contact with the legal system? What are some of the different kind of pathways or touch points where a youth of color may be coming into contact with the justice system?
Well, one, and I know we spoke about this before, but I really have to start there. Is that school to prison pipeline? I mean, the fact that, and for me, as someone whose parents were public school educators, this we stress the importance of education as really that golden key to bettering yourself. But yet, our children from pre-kindergarten through 12th grade being disproportionately targeted for discipline and punishment, be that school suspension, where we've learned that through studies from out of the University of Chicago, where when young people are out of school due suspension or expulsion, their likelihood of interacting with the juvenile justice system doubles, as well as having police in our schools and having kids arrested and pushed directly into the system. That school to prison pipeline is huge, and the disparities there in suspension and arrests, are so high as well. But also, you have to look at policing and the way our communities are policed as a significant pathway as well. When you look at the aggressive use of Terry stops or stop and frisk, and the degree to which that increases the likelihood of ending up in the system. The ACLU did a report, and for Boston, Black residents accounted for 63% of stop and frisk, while only being 25% of the city's population. 200,000 of those stops led to no arrest or charge, and contraband was only found in 2%. So you see how the way police engage with Black and brown communities is different and is harsher, and that greatly increases the likelihood that young people will be pushed into the system.
There's like this battle between how do we hold youth accountable for the things they've done, but then not be punitive and kind of end up putting them in a position that actually sets them up for failure. Well, how do you balance those two things?
Well, and to me, we have to move away from, for far too long in this country, the sole definition of accountability has been punishment. And you've seen it, for 40 years, we tried to punish people out of addiction, which was obviously going to fail, and we just kept doing it. As we sit in the midst of right now of a mental health crisis, in particular, a youth mental health crisis driven by just the isolation and anxiety and the trauma of the pandemic, you're hearing that same rhetoric of wanting to punish people. You cannot punish people out of their needs. You need to treat people's needs. Right. And there needs to be an understanding, a greater understanding that putting a person in a position to do the hard work of working on their needs and working on their issues, that is accountability. Putting someone in a box for 6 months and putting them out, just as bad off or worse off as they were before, I know that may appeal to some sense of retribution people want, but that's not helping anyone. It's not making your community safer. Taking someone and putting them in a position, particularly with diversion. I always say, if your approach leads to recidivism, no matter how much you think it's coming down hard, you're not making the community safer, and you're not helping that person at all. But when you take someone and you help them deal with the issues that led them to act out, and then you're putting them in a position where they've been able to resolve some of those issues, and they're less likely to get in trouble again, then they're not recidivating, then they're not coming back into the system, then they're not acting out in that way anymore, and then you've helped them and you've made your community safer.
So exactly what I think about is, what's the proof that the current approach is actually successfully keeping anybody safe?
We lead the world in mass incarceration. It doesn't, so my grandmother had a term when I was young, someone doing life 3 to 5 years at a time, where you punish the person over and over again and they come out over and over again, and the person doesn't get better because you've never dealt with those underlying issues that are driving their behavior. And I think it's one of those things, particularly in there are people who call New England a land of steady habits. We get very used to doing things the way that we do them. And there's this visceral reaction to change sometimes. But you have to look at parts of the system and say what we're doing clearly isn't working. And when something isn't working, you can't just double down on it because it's what you're familiar with. You have to have the courage to be willing to try something different, especially when you have data and you have those sample sizes which show that it works. Diversion works. It's not just giving a kid a free bite at the apple, which is what was derisively said about diversion in previous years. It's about saying that it's not that this young person is a problem. This young person has a problem. How do we get to the bottom of the problem? If this young person has a mental health concern and is untreated, how do we get them treatment? If this young person has gone through trauma, how do we get underneath that trauma and help them resolve that trauma? Because then you're building up stronger young men and women. You're helping them learn how to cope, to learn how to deal with their emotions. And you're just making it less likely that they end up getting into something down the road.
I like the idea of the kind of this young person is a problem versus this young person has a problem. And you're right. I think that slight distinction makes all the difference, because I think a lot of times our youth of color, they are seen as this person is a problem. And folks feel threatened by them. And so they were like, well, let's just kind of deal with them more harshly. Versus if they have a problem, okay, let's see what we can do to help them to change.
And race and poverty are real drivers of how, again, young people of every racial background and every socioeconomic status, have these sorts of issues that they're going through. It really falls on the adults and how we treat these young people and how we perceive them. That's why if we looked at all young people as they're having a problem, and the first question we have not is what are they doing, but why are they doing that? If you start your approach to young people with why, then you're able to really focus on helping young people be better, which is what we should all of us working in youth serving systems should be trying to do.
I sometimes will see kids and they'll say, oh, well, let's see if you can help them with medication. And there's only so much medication can do if you have a system that's beating you down and telling you that you really don't have much to contribute to society.
It's so true. And I know you've seen it so much in ways in the way that you've worked with, young people. But as a lawyer, it's interesting because sometimes it didn't even matter the result of the hearing or the trial or the case. Just getting in there and fighting for a kid and just letting a kid feel like, a kid who feels like everyone's just going to give up on them anyway, the mere act. And this is why I tell, regardless of what it is you do, if you step in and you just advocate for a kid, you're conveying to a kid that they're worth advocating for. And they may not have ever had anyone, or they may have had very few people who've ever done that before. Telling kids they're conveying to kids that they're worth fighting for matters.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, the work that you do is so amazing. As you mentioned, this idea that the infractions that youth kind of find themselves in, they're then being used against them later on to kind of say, well, now you have this history. So now we can kind of include this history and give you a harsher sentence as an adult. I still find it so interesting that the courts don't really recognize developmental kind of stages or ages. When will they?
The science has been there and it's been so ready and so apparent for so long. There is nothing whatsoever magical about the age of 18. No. 18 is just another stop on the way to having that frontal lobe, which controls our decision making and which, just our impulsivity and sort of our emotion relative to our logic. It's amazing that we make this determination that we treat people harsher when they aren't even fully developed for another 7 years at least. And it's tough. And when will they recognize it? I don't know. And, again, I think we have this misunderstanding of what makes people better and what makes communities safer. This idea that, you punish someone and they'll learn and not do it again. Well, we've got years of recidivism data that shows that that doesn't work. And I think when it doesn't work, people just say, oh, well, they were just bad people anyway, and they throw them away. In reality, if we focus more on treatment, if we focus more on diversion and keeping people out of the system, if we kept young people in the juvenile system longer, when at 18, you're not even out of high school most of the time. But if we kept these young people in the juvenile system and gave them more time to finish their education, develop some job skills, like think for a moment about what helps you get stable footing as an adult. Not an adult who is causing problems, but what helps you reach a level of stability. It's finishing school, getting a job, going from a job to a career, it's gaining financial stability, and then having that financial stability when you start a family, so then you can lift your children into better circumstances. When we continuously lock young people up over and over again, we're taking those milestones that are necessary to gain a firm foothold in adulthood, and we're just pushing them down the road. You have young people who are in our house of correction right now, who still haven't finished high school, who haven't gotten an equivalency, who are handicapped at getting a job. And then we wonder at that point why people, once they've aged out of that behavior, once they've matured, once they hit the mid to late 20s, we've completely put an anchor around them to their life outcomes.
Because then now there's certain jobs they can't really ever get because if you do a background check, what pops up.
100%. And that's something that I think people don't realize. I think people in general understand, like, oh, if you have a record, it can make it hard. Like, there are 209 collateral consequences of a misdemeanor conviction in Massachusetts and 752 consequences of a felony conviction. And so, and it's important to mention that because and some of those are permanent and mandatory. So not only does it keep you from getting certain jobs, it prevents you from getting certain licenses and being able to really enter, say someone who went through a lot of family strife, they get their life together, they go to college, they graduate, and they say, I want to be a family therapist. I want to help other families get the help that I never had. A record can prevent you from being able to get licensed for that, position. And so at some point in time, we have to think about these lifetime collateral consequences. There was a recent article in the Boston Globe about how the expungement that was in the 2018 law, as it is, it's virtually useless because virtually no one who needs it can utilize it. So while it's good that we do have expungement, you can expunge one case. Well, now you can expunge 2 cases, but no more than 2. In my view, once you have hit a point in your life where you are 3 years or 5 years removed from the last time you were in trouble and you have your life together, you should be able to expunge your prior record, especially your juvenile record. It makes no sense. It's not predictive of future offending. We've learned from studies that once you are 7 years removed from your last offense, you're no more likely to once you're 5 years removed from your last offense, you're no more likely to commit a crime than any other member of the general population. So why do we have 40-year-olds still having to answer a question about a conviction they were 19 on their record? It doesn't make it safer, but it makes people's lives harder. And we got to get off of this need to feel the need that we've just judged people enough and start thinking about what really makes our society better.
This feeling that we've done something about it.
Right. It's just like this constant need for retribution. It's like, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in what's going to make the people living in my community better. Because when the people who are living in my community are better, that's going to make my community safer.